creates a user fee for generic drugs and a national system to track prescription drugs. Senate leaders have been negotiating over amendments to the legislation. Some senators want an amendment to continue the National Flood Insurance Program, which expires at the end of the month. But the bill's sponsors wants to keep amendments related to the bill's purpose. And now live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. O God, our Father, shine your light on Capitol Hill and give light to each lawmaker. Illuminate their lives so that their beliefs may be certain and true. May the light of your knowledge guide them in all their decisions. Grant that, guided by your light, they will reach the light that never fails. Grant that, illuminated by your truth, they may reach the truth that is complete. Lead them, O God, so that in the end they may see light in your light and know even as they are known. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., May 22, 2012. To the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Jean Shaheen, a senator from the state of New Hampshire, to perform the duties of the chair. Son Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to count number 400, S3187.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 400 S3187, a bill to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and so forth, and for other purposes.
Madam President, we're now on the motion to proceed to the FDA user fees bill. The majority will control the first half today, Republicans the final half hour. We'll recess from 12:30 until 2:15 today to allow for our weekly caucus meetings. At 2:15, the motion to proceed to FDA legislation will be adopted, and the Harkin-Enzi substitute will be agreed to. I now ask unanimous consent that Tiffany Griffin, a fellow in Senator Boehnman's office, be granted floor privileges during the consideration of S3187.
Without objection.
Madam President, there are 12 million people in the United States who faced a cancer diagnosis today. Many have fought back against this terrible disease and won. Others are still fighting. And each one of them knows how difficult a cancer diagnosis can be. But imagine coming to terms with your diagnosis only to find out the life-saving drug you need to survive is in short supply or simply not available. I wish this were make-believe, but it's not. It's real America. That, Madam President, is a situation faced by many Americans battling cancer and other life-threatening illnesses. Through 20 weeks of chemotherapy, Landra and I, my wife, lived with the fear that the medicine she needed every Monday morning wouldn't be there because there were shortages. But fortunately for us, the drug was always accessible. Many Americans haven't been so fortunate. One Nevadan fighting bladder cancer was near the end of treatment when the medicine he was taking suddenly ran short. Now, Madam President, only time will tell whether the alternative treatment that he received was enough to save his life. Another Nevada woman with bowel cancer was forced to choose a less effective chemotherapy treatment because the best drug on the market, one that cures bowel cancer in 75% of the cases, wasn't available. Only time will tell whether the second choice medicine was effective. Yet another Nevada man was relying on 2 cancer drugs to keep him alive longer and give him greater quality of life. But one drug was in short supply. Since drugs only work when taken together, doctors have been able to treat him intermittently. That isn't good. So only time will tell how many days or weeks or months or years he lost because he couldn't get the drug he needed. Every day these stories play out in hospitals across our country. Every day Americans experience shortages of life-saving, FDA-approved drugs and treatments. These shortages literally put Americans at risk. And as the number of shortages increases each year, more patients are forced to wait for treatment and worry. In the last 6 years, drug shortages have quadrupled. Last year, FDA reported shortage of 231 drugs, including many chemotherapy medicines. That's 231 drugs. How many tens of thousands of people did that affect? Public pressure has prompted some drug makers to voluntarily notify the FDA of impending shortages. But Congress must step in to improve communication between drug makers, the FDA, and doctors. Doctors who have to break the terrible news that life-saving medicines aren't available. Voluntary cooperation between drug makers and the FDA prevented almost 200 drug shortages last year. But establishing effective lines of communication could further reduce the number of shortages and save patients' lives. So I'm pleased the spirit of bipartisanship begun by my colleagues, Senator Harkin-Enzi, continued yesterday. I look forward to an orderly amendment process, and I'm optimistic that the Senate will move this legislation without unnecessary delays. I hope, Madam President, I'm not disappointed. Each year, more than 1.5 million Americans are diagnosed with some form of cancer. It's up to us to ensure not one of them waits and wonders if the medicine he or she needs to stay alive will be there when the need arises.
Madam President.
The Republican leader.
I want to call attention to a couple of stories from the last 2 days. I think they say a lot about the difficulties of addressing the economic challenges we face. The first is a story from Politico. It says the Budget Committee chairman can't remember the last time he talked to the president. The Budget Committee chairman can't remember the last time he talked to the president. Another chairman dealing with student loans says he hasn't talked to the president in months. In months. The Democratic point man on energy doesn't seem to talk to the president much at all. Madam President, if you want to know why we can't solve these economic problems, this is it. We've got a president who's more interested in running around to college campuses spreading some poll-tested message than he is in actually accomplishing anything. That's the problem. Now, the second story, also interesting, is about HHS signing a $20 million contract to promote Obamacare. $20 million of taxpayer money to promote a bill most Americans want to see repealed. $20 million of our tax money spent on commercials to promote Obamacare. Madam President, let me suggest that the President spend a little more time trying to do something about spending, the debt, and gas prices, and a little less time trying to spend the unpopular things he's already done. It might require a little more work, but it's what we need. It's time to lead. So I would ask consent that those 2 articles to which I just referred appear in the record at this point.
Without objection.
Now, Madam President, on another matter, yesterday we learned about the resignation of the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Dr. Gregory Jaczko. As I said yesterday, I'm not surprised by Jaczko's resignation. Even Democrats on the NRC testified before Congress that his inappropriate conduct as chairman resulted in a hostile work environment for women and threatened to undermine the mission of the NRC itself. But what should surprise all of us is how this administration could remain silent for more than a year after the allegations of Yasko's offensive behavior first surfaced. Yasko's alleged behavior is unacceptable in any workplace. The fact that it was allowed to persist at a critical agency that oversees the safety of our nation's nuclear power plants is astonishing. The White House must now move swiftly with a replacement for Yasko, and I urge the Senate to move quickly to reconfirm the nomination of Christine Savinicki as NRC Commissioner before her term expires on June 30th. Now, the only reason her nomination, Commissioner Savinicki's nomination, was held up by the White House and the Democratic-led Senate in the first place was because she had the courage to stand up to a hostile work environment and to the bully who was responsible for it. Now that Yasko has submitted his resignation, it's time for the Senate to move forward on Christine Savinicki. Commissioner Savinicki's credentials are unmatched. She is one of the world's leading experts on nuclear safety. She was confirmed by the Senate to her current term without a single dissenting vote. It's time we act. Savinicki has served as commissioner with distinction, is enormously qualified, has bipartisan support, and deserves a speedy reconfirmation. The American people are best served by a commission that is fully functional. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the following hour will be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the majority controlling the first half and the Republicans controlling the final half.
I suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.
Yeah.
Madam President,
The senator from Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with,
Without objection.
and I ask consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I take this time to just bring to my colleagues' attention that we are celebrating National Small Business Week, which is a very important occasion because, as I know the senator from New Hampshire understands, the growth engine for America is with our small businesses. If you're looking at job growth, which we all know we need in order to get our economy moving again, we know that there will be more jobs created from small companies than from large companies. About 2 out of every 3 jobs that are created in America will come from small companies. We also know that if you're looking at innovation, who follows the patents, who comes up with the creative new ideas for America to become as competitive as we need to, it will be more from the smaller companies. There's an incredibly larger number of patents per employee from small companies than from large companies. So the growth engine for America's economy really rests with our small businesses. I'm proud to serve on the Small Business Committee under the leadership of Chairman Landrieu. We have brought forward many initiatives to help small businesses, and I think it's made a huge difference as our economy is starting to recover, as we look at now 25 consecutive months of continuous private sector job growth, where we've turned around the economy and we're now growing. In large measure, I think it's because of the attention that we've paid to the small business community. We are proud of what it's meant for our entire country. And let me just give a little bit about my own state of Maryland. We have over 500,000 small businesses in Maryland that employ over 1 million people in my state in small businesses. So it is by far a huge part of the Maryland economy. Our strategy over the last several years during the Obama administration has been to concentrate on small businesses to help them recover, particularly from this economic recession. The first effort was to increase the capacity of the Small Business Administration. I was proud of the Obama budget that put more money back into the Small Business Administration. I was proud of the initiative that we had in the Senate to add funds to the Small Business Administration so that they could indeed be the advocates for the small business community. So they had someone in the government that was fighting for their issues, and it's made a huge difference. I think if you talk, as I have, to the small businesses in Maryland, they tell me they have now much greater capacity for help through counselors and advocates at the Small Business Administration. We then went to deal with the #1 issue that was brought to our attention, and I'm sure that you heard the same stories in New Hampshire that I heard in Maryland, that small businesses had a hard time getting access to capital, that we had to do a better job of making capital available, particularly during a tough economic period where small businesses don't have the same deep pockets that the larger companies had, that we needed to do a better job. So we increased the SBA loan limits, increased the amount of federal guarantee in order to make it more attractive for banks to lend money to small businesses, knowing full well that the government was standing behind those loans. That made some monies available. We look for creative new programs to help our small businesses, one in the Treasury Department to help. We also looked at helping our states in partnership with our states. I know that in Maryland, the additional funds that we made available in Washington to help build the state program has made many more loans available to small companies in Maryland. All that has helped in providing opportunities for our small businesses. The reauthorization, the SBIR program and the STR program has made a huge difference. Since 1983 in my own state of Maryland, $1.5 billion of funding have come from the SBIR program. For those who are listening who may not know what this program is about, it's innovation. It's small companies that are involved in the biotech and cybertech areas where they use innovation to create jobs. In my state and your state, Madam President, they are using these funds to create the opportunity for America to be competitive internationally. And we can state chapter and verse for our national defense research or for clean energy technology, where small businesses taking advantage of these innovative research grants have been able to build jobs in our community and make America more competitive for the future. The reauthorization and predictability of funding under the SBIR program, increasing the amounts that are available, will create and has already created more job opportunities. We got that done, and that was certainly a major step forward. We've passed bills providing tax breaks to small businesses, the expensing of their equipment so they can go out and buy equipment and keep things moving. Can I have consent for an additional 5 minutes?
Is there objection? Without objection.
I thank my friend from Arizona for his courtesy, and I'll try not to use the entire 5 minutes. There are other areas where we have also moved forward with help for small businesses, credits for their health insurance so they can cover their employees. In my own state of Maryland, we've set up an African trade office, which has provided opportunities in international trade, an area where we think we can still make progress. I could talk about many of the success stories in Maryland, small businesses that have used the SBIR program to develop the reaction to smallpox vaccines to make them more efficient. We've had examples of where we're now developing a vaccine to deal with the common cold. I was at an SBA event where we honored our leading entrepreneurs in our state and could tell you an example of where a small business person, Janet Ammerhoff, who was the Small Business Person of the Year, a software development company. She's had some personal issues with her own health, but despite that, for the last 3 years, has had 190% growth in her revenues. This is the innovation we have in Maryland that comes out of the small business community. The tailor-made transportation services that first qualified as an 8A under the AA programs, now has graduated from that. Started with a small transportation company that provided transportation for people with special needs, now providing a diversified transportation system in our community. All of that is developed through small business programs that we help develop. But I come to the floor to announce a new initiative that I will be following today, and that is the Small Business Goaling Act to deal with another problem we have with small businesses that I hope we will be able to take up on the floor of the Senate in the very near future. It would increase the prime goals for small businesses in government procurement from 23% to 25%, and increased the subcontracting goals to 40%, adding transparency to how government provides procurement opportunities under government contracts to small businesses. We have taken some action in dealing with bundling and trying to prevent the bundling of small contracts into large contracts that makes it more difficult for small businesses to get prime contracts. This legislation will make it, I think, more transparent and visible so that we can, in fact, provide more opportunities so that the government leads by example by using small companies more to help them grow. I really do. It will help not only small businesses, but those with, that we have service-disabled veteran companies, we have women-owned companies, minority-owned companies, all will benefit from these opportunities. I want to thank the chairperson of the Small Business Committee, Senator Landrieu, for her extraordinary help in getting this bill together. It will help small businesses by allowing them to grow, create jobs, and help our country in recovery. Once again, I want to thank my friend from Arizona for giving me these extra few moments and just encourage my colleagues that the best way to help celebrate National Small Business Week is for us to pay more attention to helping small businesses grow. And with that, I would yield the floor. President, may I? I have 8 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have been approved by the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
And with that, I yield the floor.
Thank you, Madam President.
The senator from Arizona.
I would like today to add a little context to the discussion of the fiscal cliff that our nation approaches, a reference to the combination of the largest tax increase in history, new taxes under Obamacare, sequestration, and the expiration of the payroll tax holiday, all of which take effect in January of 2013 unless the President and the Congress act. This is a key discussion to have because how we view the so-called fiscal cliff defines our perspective on how an economy grows and prospers. Edward Lazier, who's a former chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, recently wrote an op-ed that outlines the various perspectives. I'll focus on the two most prominent, the Keynesian view and the view of supply-side economics. Keynesian theory holds that spending is the key to growth, government spending. Keynesians believe that in recessionary times, increased government spending can take the place of private sector activity. And that's why they present a false choice between government spending cuts, in other words, austerity, and growth. Their perspective holds that growth is contingent on government spending. This was the thinking behind the President's 2009 stimulus spending package, the so-called cash for clunkers, and a litany of other recent government spending programs, transfer payments, and temporary tax credits. The administration's insistence on enacting these temporary Keynesian spending policies to stimulate consumption, I believe, is misguided, and the evidence reveals has failed. Remember, the stimulus was sold as a measure to keep unemployment from topping 8%, but in fact unemployment hasn't dipped below 8% for 39 months, and growth is very anemic. We're experiencing a recovery in name only, so there isn't much evidence that spending can revitalize a sagging economy, that is to say, government spending. And even if government spending could be a boost, as Lazier points out, the costs would be massive. Here's what he writes. Even if a fiscal stimulus has some benefit, the cost of fiscal policy is likely to be very large. In order to stimulate the economy, growth in, not just high levels of government spending, is required. To provide a stimulus comparable to the 2009 legislation, we would need to increase government spending by $250 billion. And he goes on, the Keynesian view implies that keeping spending constant at the higher level in 2014 would generate no stimulative growth for 2014 because there is no increase in spending over the 2013 level. If we want to delay our day of reckoning, he writes, we must keep spending at a higher level for each year that we want to postpone the negative consequences for growth, end of quote. Supply-side economics, on the other hand, holds a different perspective on growth, that government spending does not increase prosperity, that tax hikes hurt the economy and stifle growth. We believe that economic growth stems from combining three inputs: labor, capital, and technology. These three factors of production result in output that we can then consume. Without labor, capital, and technology, there can be no consumption. Focusing on policies that stimulate consumption targets the wrong side of the equation. In order to get the economy going, we need to focus on the inputs: labor, capital, and technology. We also believe that government spending cuts are beneficial because they free up private capital and help align revenues with government spending. Lazier argues that supply-siders stand on the firmest ground when it comes to fiscal policy's effect on economic growth. Here's what he writes. On the tax side, there is strong evidence that supports the supply-siders, end of quote. And he cites, for example, research from Christina Romer. By the way, Christina Romer was President Obama's first chair of his Council of Economic Advisors. And her research shows that raising taxes by 1% of GDP, raising taxes, which is what the administration proposes, lowers our gross domestic product by nearly 3%. So increase taxes by 1%, you lose 3% of gross domestic product. I recently joined 40 of my Republican colleagues in sending a letter to Leader Reid to make this point. The tax increases will have a deleterious effect on economic growth. The letter asks that he join us in working to take the tax threat off the table before the election in order to create more economic certainty. We know that so-called tax-mageddon is coming, and there's no good reason not to act. The election is not an acceptable excuse. In fact, I would posit that politicians could be rewarded for acting to avert the catastrophic effect of this huge tax increase. In addition to acting to prevent tax hikes, Congress should also pursue spending cuts to help unleash private capital, boost growth, and reduce our nearly $16 trillion national debt in the process. To be clear, cutting government spending does not mean that government should take a sledgehammer approach and cut indiscriminately. We should be careful where we cut. We should prioritize. For example, I oppose the defense cuts on national security grounds, not Keynesian grounds. In other words, while it's true that cuts in defense spending will result in job losses, big job losses under sequestration, our national security is even more important. The automatic spending cuts under sequestration mean that across-the-board spending to the Department of Defense will, in the words of the Secretary of Defense, devastate our national security. Allowing the sequester to begin as planned would cut 10% from defense in fiscal year 2013 alone and dramatically shrink the size and capabilities of our military. To avoid this, the Senate should follow the lead of the House of Representatives, which recently passed legislation to replace the sequester with other spending reductions. The legislation will cut $315 billion in spending and will reduce the deficit by over $242 billion. It's not a perfect bill, but I do believe it's a good place to start. My overarching point is this. We should not shy away from prudent spending cuts for fear that they will hurt growth. It shouldn't be difficult to find cuts in our $3.7 trillion budget. These cuts certainly will not derail economic growth if they're done the right way. The choice, in other words, between spending cuts and growth is a false choice. If the President is truly concerned about boosting growth and reversing the trends of the last 3.5 years, he should stop presenting this false choice, as he did, for example, at the G8 summit last weekend, where he actually encouraged German Chancellor Angela Merkel and other leaders to embrace what he called a growth package, modeled in part after his own budget-busting stimulus spending. I hope that Chancellor Merkel and leaders around the world take a very close look at whether the Obama growth package is something they wish to bring home after observing the American economy for the last 4 years. Preventing tax increases and reducing out-of-control spending is a better approach to long-term prosperity. Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent that at the conclusion of my remarks, the record carry the op-ed I referred to by Edward Lazier in the Wall Street Journal of May 21st.
Without objection.
Madam President.
The senator from Iowa.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm pleased to see that Jessica Rosenworcel and Ajit Pai have been confirmed to the Federal Communications Commission. They're both highly qualified, and it's unfortunate that the FCC's stubborn refusal to respond to my very simple request for information forced me to place a hold on their nominations for the past 4 months in order to get the FCC to move on giving me the information that any member of Congress ought to be entitled to. The FCC needs to learn a simple lesson from this episode. The public's business ought to be public, and transparency brings accountability. Eventually, the truth will be known, so you might as well get it out there when the questions first come up. I initially placed my hold on the FCC commissioner nominees because the FCC had stonewalled a document request that I submitted on April the 27th last year regarding their actions related to a company called Light Squared and the hedge fund Harbinger Capital that owns Light Squared. Before I wrote my letter on Light Squared, many concerns had already been raised regarding the company's plans for a terrestrial network and its potential to interfere with the global positioning system, or sometimes that's referred to as GPS. In my first letter, I raised those concerns as well. Unfortunately, the FCC doesn't appear to have taken those concerns seriously, but months later, independent testing verified the danger Light Squared posed to industries from commercial aviation to even our own armed forces. It seems strange that a project that was so obviously flawed was allowed to go so far, but Light Squared had help. In total, Light Squared has paid 53 different lobbyists, some registered, some unregistered. They paid 1 former governor, 3 former senators, 9 former members of Congress, including a former speaker and former minority leader, and a former White House counsel to advocate for them that Light Squared ought to go through. These lobbyists provided entry into the FCC and the White House, but they couldn't change the fact that Light Squared's network simply couldn't coexist with GPS. Light Squared has now declared bankruptcy, and it appears that its plan to build a terrestrial network are over, but many questions still remain. Some of those questions: why did the FCC give Light Squared this unusual waiver in the first place? Why did Light Squared's lawyers mention campaign contributions when they sought meetings at the White House? Why did a 4-star general claim he had been pressured by the Obama administration not to criticize Light Squared? When I first asked the FCC for documents, I was told that they would take about 2 years to respond to my request through Freedom of Information. Then they told me that they do not voluntarily turn over documents to the 99 6/10% of the members of Congress and senators who do not chair a committee with direct jurisdiction over FCC. After a lot of back and forth with the FCC, they told me the reason they don't respond to 99 6/10% of Congress is because of just a one-line statement in the Congressional Research Service report. The line reads, quote, oversight is most effective if it's conducted by congressional committees of jurisdiction, end of quote. Now, the FCC somehow took this quote and conveniently came up with the idea that they don't have to give this senator any documents. And, of course, to anybody in the Congress, this makes no sense whatsoever, but that's what the FCC hid behind. And, of course, you know me, I didn't give up. The FCC's response to me is just another variation on what the Justice Department told me when I started asking questions about Operation Fast and Furious. Unfortunately, we have members of the House of Representatives that aren't afraid to ask this administration some tough questions. In Fast and Furious, it was Chairman Issa who held the Justice Department's feet to the fire to make sure that they responded fully and responded completely. When light squared, or with light squared, it was another committee in the House of Representatives, the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Chairman Walden, Upton, and Stearns and their staffs have done an excellent job in making sure the FCC is open, transparent, and provides documents to Congress, even when they don't want to give those documents to a senator that asked for them, meaning this senator. I would also like to thank Commerce Committee Chairman Rockefeller here in the Senate for pressing the FCC personally to release documents. With all this help, we're making sure that the FCC is open with the American people about the way they operate, because transparency brings accountability. In over 30 years of conducting oversight, I can say that when it comes to providing documents to the Congress, the FCC is one of the worst federal agencies that I've ever had to deal with. Even after receiving a document request from the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House of Representatives, the FCC still tried to play the tired old games that agencies play when they aren't acting in good faith. When they finally turned over their first batch of documents, would you believe it? Those documents were already publicly available on the Internet through Freedom of Information Act. So they weren't giving us anything that we didn't already have access to. Now, then there was, when they didn't convince us that they were acting in good faith, because quite frankly they weren't, they gave us a second production. But even of the first 1,968 pages that they produced, all but 3, in other words, 1,965 pages, were newspaper clippings. Again, the FCC was playing games. And, of course, that's just not acceptable. Fortunately, we have continued to press the FCC, and we now, with the help of the House of Representatives, have approximately 8,000 non-public internal documents. Still, we have not received all responsive documents from the FCC yet. We just received another 4,000 pages of documents, and I've been told that approximately 7,000 more documents are on their way to Congress. So we now at least have a path forward. That is why I lifted my holds a couple weeks ago, so that these nominations could move forward. I trust that the House committee will ensure that the FCC provides those 7,000 or so additional documents. I've always said that if you're hiding something, it's best to get it out in the open, because the longer you stonewall, meaning in this case the FCC, the worse you're going to look when those facts finally come out. The FCC has attempted to stonewall my request for documents for almost a year, and they have failed. But they failed only thanks to the help provided by the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and because of that help, we're finally able to review internal documents from the FCC, the very same documents we should have gotten when we first asked our request April 27th last year. As I said when I initially filed my intent to object, I strongly believe that it is critical for Congress to have access to documents in order to conduct vigorous and independent oversight. Whether it takes 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, or even 1 year, as it did in this case, I will continue to pursue transparency across the federal government because transparency brings accountability. This is essential so that Congress can practice its constitutional role of oversight over the federal government. The role of oversight is this simple. Congress passes laws and appropriates money. That's not the end of it. Our government is a government of checks and balances. We have a responsibility after passing laws, after appropriating money, to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed and the money spent according to the intent of Congress. That's oversight. Even now, as we review these documents that we've already gotten and begin conducting interviews with key FCC staff, the investigation obviously continues. Step one was getting access to the FCC emails. It took this step so that we could make sure that we had the facts before we jumped to conclusions. Now it's time for step two, asking some hard questions of the key FCC personnel who approved the light squared waiver. This process may continue to take more time, but however long the process takes, I will continue to press for transparency at the FCC because with transparency comes accountability. This agency must operate in an open and transparent manner, and we must have answers regarding the light squared waiver. The people at the FCC work for the American people. They don't work for themselves. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.